Giant Guido declared, "You will marry me now," and the poor cowboy had no choice. The trap of Whisper Creek, Caleb Cal McCoy, had seen his share of sun-baked trails and dust-choked town. His leather boots, once fine, now bore the scars of 1,000 miles, each scuff a testament to a life lived on the fringes, chasing whispers of prosperity that always seemed to dissipate like heat hazes over the scorching Nevada. Scrub, a cowboy by trade, a drifter by circumstance, Cal was currently in a bind, and it wasn't just the last few cents jingling in his pocket telling him so. His horse, old Rusty, had thrown a shoe mealy's back, and now they were limping through a desolate stretch known as the Whisper Creek Badlands, a place locals avoided like the plague, muttering tales of strange disappearances and an unnerving stillness that clung to the air. The sun beat down with an oppressive fury, baking the earth to a brittle crisp. Cal squinted, his eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of water, a ranch, anything that wasn't more jagged rock and skeletal brush. Justa's despair began to gnaw at the edges of his resolve. A peculiar sight caught his eye. Nestled deep within a surprisingly verdant canyon, almost hidden until one was practically upon it, stood a homestead. But not just any homestead. This one was outsized. The barn timbers were thicker, the fence posts taller, and the main house, though built of humble, rough-hewn logs, seemed to stretch towards the sky with an unnatural height, its windows like dark, watchful eyes. A plume of smoke curled lazily from a stone chimney, a beacon of life in the silent expanse. Hope, a rare commodity for Cal these days, surged. He nudged the Rusty forward, wincing at the horse's labored gait. As they drew closer, the silence of the canyon was broken only by the creak of his saddle and the rhythmic clop-tread of Rusty's unshod hoof. No dogs barked, no chickens clucked, no voices carried on the wind. An unsettling quiet permeated the air, but the promise of water and rest overruled Cal's growing unease. He dismounted at a massive unpainted gate, its hinges groaning like an old man's knees as he pushed it open. The yard was meticulously kept, swept clean of dust and debris, but still eerily devoid of activity. Cal led Rusty towards a well, its stone rim worn smooth by countless draws of water. As Rusty drank deeply, Cal cupped water in his hands, splashing it over his face, feeling the grit of the trail wash away. It was then he heard it, a low, resonant hum, like a distant beehive, emanating from the colossal house. "Well, now," a voice boomed, startling Cal, so much he nearly dropped his hat. It wasn't just loud, it was deep, commanding, and rich with an unmistakable feminine timbre. He spun around, hand instinctively going for the worn grip of his revolver, but freezing as his eyes landed on the figure standing on the porch. She was immense. Not merely tall, but built on a scale that defied belief. Her shoulders were broad, her frame solid, draped in a simple, dark calico dress that nevertheless seemed to hold the power of a tempest. Her face, framed by dark, braided hair that reached her waist, was severe, etched with lines that spoke of hardship and unyielding will. Her eyes, dark as obsidian, fixed on him with an unnerving intensity. Cal, a man who stood a respectable 6 feet, felt like a child looking up at an ancient redwood. She must have been nearly 8 feet tall, maybe more, and her presence filled the entire porch, casting a long shadow even in the midday sun. "You're a long way from anywhere, cowboy," she stated, her voice rumbling like distant thunder, "and you look like you could use a meal." Cal, still reeling from the shock of her size, managed to stammer, My apologies. My horse lost a shoe. I saw your smoke. Didn't mean to trespass." A faint, almost imperceptible smirk touched her lips. "Trespass? No, I don't reckon you did. You walked right into where you were meant to be." She descended the porch steps, each stride covering ground Cal would take 3 to traverse. The earth seemed to barely register her weight, yet her movements possessed a deliberate power. As she neared, Cal could make out the details. Hands the size of dinner plates, calloused and strong, yet surprisingly graceful, a presence that dwarfed him, not just physically, but emotionally. Fear, cold and sharp, began to prickle at his skin. She stopped a few feet from him. Ergacion wavering. My name is Elara Grimshaw. This is my land. And you, cowboy, are now my husband. The words hung in the still air, heavier than any midday heat. Cal's mind reeled. He blinked, trying to process the absurdity, the sheer audacity of the declaration. Ma'am, I don't rightly know what you mean. I'm just passing through. Elara's eyes narrowed, and the subtle hint of a smile vanished. Passing through. No, you misunderstand. You're staying. I've been alone too long. This land needs a man. This house needs a man. And I. Her gaze swept over him, appraising, demanding, I need a husband. Her voice dropped to a low, gravelly tone that sent a shiver down Cal's spine. And you, Caleb McCoy, are him. You will marry me now. Cal looked around, desperately. The vast empty canyon stretched for miles in every direction. There was no one else, no other ranches, no path of escape. Rusty stood placidly, oblivious to his master's sudden, terrifying predicament. The woman before him, Elara Grimshaw, was a force of nature, a mountain of a woman, and her will seemed as unyielding as the granite cliffs surrounding them. He tried to think, to find an argument, a way out. But, Mamam, I don't even know you, and marriage, that's not something you just declare. Elara took another step closer, looming over him. Her shadow enveloped him completely. It is when I declare it. Her voice was soft now, almost a whisper, but it vibrated with an authority that left no room for doubt. You have no choice, cowboy. None at all. He looked into those dark, unwavering eyes, and in them he saw not madness, but an absolute, unshakable certainty. And in that moment, Cal McCoy, the drifter who prided himself on his independence, understood. He was trapped by the sheer, overwhelming presence of Elara Grimshaw, the giant widow of Whisper Creek. His options, like his last few coins, had dwindled to zero. The immediate aftermath of Elara Grimshaw's declaration was a whirlwind of stunned silence on Cal's part and decisive action on hers. He stood frozen, trying to reconcile the impossible reality. Before him with the basic laws of common sense. He was a free man, a cowboy of the open range, and here he was, being told he was to be married by a woman who could likely lift his horse with one hand. Come inside, cowboy, Elara commanded, her voice softening slightly, though the underlying authority remained absolute. You look parched. We have preparations to make. Cal, still dazed, found himself following her massive form into the house. The interior was as outsize as the exterior. High ceilings, sturdy furniture, built for larger frames, and a vast uncluttered space that spoke of practicality rather than warmth. A massive cast-iron stove dominated the kitchen, its warmth a stark contrast to the chill that had settled in Cal's bones. Why me? Cal blurted, his voice cracking slightly. There must be other men. Elara turned from where she was drawing water from an indoor pump, her movements efficient and powerful. Other men? She scoffed, a dark amusement flickering in her eyes. This land, this life, frightens most men away. Those who stay are weak, or they have designs on what's mine. You, Caleb McCoy, you have the look of a man who knows how to survive. And you walked right to my door. Fate, I reckon. She poured the water into a mug that seemed like a small bucket in Cal's hand. Besides, she added, her gaze is sharpening. I need a husband to tend to certain matters, to manage the hens when they come to help with the herd, to simply be here. A visible presence. This land respects strength, and with you by my side, that strength is undeniable. Carl took a gulp of the cool water, his throat dry. But I don't know the first thing about managing a ranch this size, and I certainly don't know the first thing about being a husband to someone like you. Edar to look at her fully, feeling the utter inadequacy of his own frame beside hers. Elara's lips thinned. You'll learn. And as for being a husband, that's simple enough. You'll eat my food, sleep in my bed, and do as I say. The rest will come. She moved with surprising speed for her size, gathering ingredients. We'll have a small ceremony at sundown. It'll be just us. The land is my witness, and its law is mine. The day crawled by with the leaden slowness of a nightmare. Elara showed him around her property with an efficiency that left no room for argument or escape attempts. He saw the vastness of her pastures, the sturdy corrals built for equally sturdy livestock, and the heavy tools that no ordinary man could wield for long. She spoke of her late husband, a man rumored to be of similar stature, who had passed years ago, leaving her to manage the sprawling, isolated empire alone. Her tone was devoid of sentimentality, purely practical. Carl's mind raced, searching for an angle. Could he overpower her? Laughable. Could he outrun her? Unlikely. She covered ground with shocking speed. Could he simply refuse? The look in her eyes had answered that. It wasn't a request. It was a decree. As the sun began its slow descent, painting the canyon walls in fiery hues of orange and purple, Elara led him to a small, enclosed patio at the back of the house. A rough-hewn table, clearly built for a much larger person, served as their altar. She had changed into a dark, unadorned dress of a finer cloth, and had braided her long, dark hair with a few wild flowers, a strange touch of tenderness in her imposing presence. Do you, Caleb McCoy, take Elara Grimshaw to be your lawfully wedded wife? She recited, her voice echoing slightly in the confined space. There was no preacher, no witness, just the two of them and the vast, silent land. Cal swallowed, his tongue feeling like sandpaper. His heart hammered against his ribs. He wanted to scream, to run, to disappear into the vastness of the desert he had so recently cursed. But the weight of her gaze, the sheer impossibility of resistance, pressed down on him. His freedom, his very essence, felt like it was slipping through his fingers, replaced by the crushing weight of her will. I do, he forced out, the words feeling alien and false on his tongue. Elara's eyes seemed to soften, a flicker of something akin to satisfaction, or perhaps triumph. And I, Elara Grimshaw, take you, Caleb McCoy, to be my lawfully wedded husband. She reached out a hand, not for a ring, but simply to take his. Her grip was firm, enveloping, and surprisingly warm. It was a gesture of possession, of ownership, more than affection. The ceremony, if one could call it that, was over. He was married to a giant woman in the middle of nowhere by her own decree. The first few days of their marriage were a blur of bewildered discomfort for Kat. He slept in a massive bed beside her, feeling like a doll, acutely aware of the sheer scale of her presence. Elara was surprisingly domestic, cooking hearty, immense meals that would feed a dozen regular men, and she expected him to eat his fill. She put him to work, assigning tasks that were just within his capabilities, but always under her watchful eye. He fixed fences, tended to Rusty, and began to learn the routines of the ranch. Every attempt he made to subtly explore escape routes was met with an almost psychic awareness from Elara. He faced straight too far, towards the canyon mouth. She'd appear, seemingly out of nowhere, her shadow falling over him. Best not wonder. Husband, the Badlands are unforgiving to those who don't know their ways. Ertoni was never threatening, merely stating a fact. But the underlying message was clear. You are mine, and you are watched. He found himself constantly observing her, searching for a weakness, a flaw, anything that would give him an advantage. She moved with an easy grace that belied her size, her movements fluid and strong. She rarely smiled, but when she did, it was a subtle, almost imperceptible twitch of her lips, a moment of fleeting amusement that made her seem even more formidable. One evening, as he sat nursing a cup of coffee, feeling utterly defeated, he watched her knitting, her massive fingers deftly working delicate yarn. The incongruity of it struck him. "Why?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Why me? Why this? Why not just hired hands or go to a town?" Elara looked up, her dark eyes piercing. "Because a hired hand can leave. A town offers too many distractions, too many eyes. I need stability, a foundation. And I chose you because you were brave enough or foolish enough to come here. You have a spark in your eyes, a will to live, even when you're trapped. That, Caleb, is a rare quality." She paused, then added, her voice softer than he'd ever heard it, "And because I was tired of being alone." That mission, raw and simple, hung in the air. It wasn't a plea for sympathy, but a statement of fact, a chink in the formidable armor he perceived. Cal looked at her, truly looked, and for the first time he saw not just a giant widow, but Elara Grimshaw, a woman of immense power and profound solitude. Still felt like a prisoner, but now a flicker of something else, something akin to a reluctant understanding, began to stir within him. His chains were still there, but perhaps, just perhaps, they were not as unbreakable as he had first believed. Weeks bled into months at the Grimshaw ranch. Cal's initial panic had subsided, replaced by a weary resignation, seasoned with a growing, reluctant curiosity. He was still a prisoner, but a prisoner with a purpose, a role, however, unwillingly assigned. He learned the rhythm of Elara's life, which was inexorably tied to the rhythm of the land. So as a meticulous rancher, knowledgeable about every head of cattle, every acre of her vast domain, her strength wasn't just physical, it was an innate understanding of the harsh western landscape and how to tame it, or at least coexist with it. Cal found himself falling into a routine. It rose before dawn, tended to Rusty, who was now fat and sleek, surprisingly content in his oversized stable, and then embarked on the tasks Elara laid out, repaired fences that seemed to span forever, mended tack that dwarfed his hands, and learned to manage the few head of massive, sturdy cattle he bred. He rarely saw other people. Occasionally, a lone prospector or a group of Mexican vaqueros would pass by, wary and keeping their distance, respecting the unspoken boundaries of Elara's territory. When they did, Elara would emerge, a silent, towering presence, and her reputation alone was enough to ensure they kept moving. He learned her habits. She preferred silence. But sometimes, late at night, he would hear her humming a low, mournful tune, a melody as vast and lonely as the desert itself. She ate simply but heartily, and her meals, though unvaried, were always nourished. She read tattered books by the dim light of a lantern, preferring tales of ancient kings and distant lands to the dim novels of the West. Cal began to test the boundaries, subtly at first. He would ride a little further than necessary, when checking fences or take a circuitous route back to the ranch. Elara never stopped him directly, but he'd always find her waiting on the porch upon his return, her gaze acknowledging his minor transgression with a silent, knowing judgment. He never managed to get truly out of sight, never felt truly unsupervised. It was like living under the gaze of a benevolent, but omniscient, God. He also started to notice the nuances of her giant. It wasn't just immense size. She seemed to possess an almost supernatural awareness of her surroundings. She could hear the slightest disturbance miles away, sense changes in the weather long before the clouds gathered, and seemed to communicate with the horses and cattle through an unspoken understanding. Was she truly a giant, or was it something more? A manifestation of the land itself, imbued with its power. The local legends of Whisper Creek, which he dismissed as drunken ramblings, began to take on a terrifying new context. One sweltering afternoon, while Cal was attempting to fix a stubborn wagon wheel, a task made agonizingly difficult by its sheer size, he heard a commotion from the south. The distant rumble of horses, too many for a lone rider, too fast for a leisurely journey. Elara emerged from the house, her eyes scanning the horizon. Rustlers, she stated, her voice devoid of emotion, a mere observation. They're trying to cut around the eastern ridge. Bold ones. Cal's blood ran cold. Rustlers were a dangerous breed, often ruthless. He looked at Elara, then at his sidearm. A small pistol compared to the scale of the threat. What do we do? Elara merely strolled towards the immense barn, retrieving a rifle that looked like a cannon in Cal's hand. It was clearly custom-made for her. It stuck thick as a tree trunk, its barrel long and heavy. We remind them whose land this is. Cal, despite his fear, felt a surge of something akin to grim admiration. There was no hesitation, no fear in her, only a cold, hard resolve. He grabbed his own revolver, feeling ridiculously small. They rode out, Elara on a colossal draft horse that made Rusty look like a pony. She moved with an intimidating grace, her rifle held casually in one hand. Cal, riding alongside, felt a strange blend of dread and exhilaration. This was different from escaping. This was defending, and for the first time, he was on her side. They found the rustlers attempting to cut a small herd of Elara's cattle. There were 4 of them, hardened men with dust-caked faces and desperate eyes. When they saw the towering figure of Elara Grimshaw, their initial bravado faltered. One of them, a grizzled old-timer, swore under his breath. "Grimshaw, you got no right to this range," he yelled, his voice cracking. Elara didn't respond with words. She simply raised her massive rifle. The shot echoed through the canyon, impossibly loud, kicking up dust at the feet of the rustler's horse, making it rear violently. It wasn't meant to kill, just to send a message. And the message was clear. The rustlers, despite their numbers, looked at each other, their bravado evaporating. They'd heard the legends, of course, but seeing the giant widow in person, facing her unwavering resolve, was another matter entirely. They looked at Cal, riding beside her, a regular-sized man, seemingly under her thrall. They exchanged a few panicked words. Then, turning their horses, they spurred them away, disappearing into the dust from which they came. Elara lowered her rifle, her gaze still fixed on the disappearing figures. "Foolish men," she murmured. "They never learn." Cal looked at her, a new understanding dawning. Her size wasn't just a physical attribute, it was a psychological weapon, a legende made flesh. He hadn't just been captured by a giant woman, he had been absorbed into a legend, a part of the Grimshaw Ranch's defense. That evening, as they ate, Cal found himself talking more freely, describing the rustlers' panicked faces, a small, genuine laugh escaping him. Elara watched him, a faint, almost tender amusement in her dark eyes. "You handled yourself well, husband," she said, her voice surprisingly soft. "You were ready to stand your ground." "Had no choice, did I?" Cal retorted, a hint of his old self-preservation sarcasm returning. Then he paused. "But thank you. It was something." Elara nodded, her gaze drifting out the window to the vast, star-strewn sky. "This land takes a toll," she said. "But it also gives. It makes you strong. Like it made me." Cal looked at her, the lines of her face illuminated by the flickering lamplight. He saw the strength, yes, but also the profound isolation, the burden of her unique existence. He was still a prisoner, still bound by her will, but he was no longer just an unwilling captive. He was a participant, perhaps even an unwitting partner in the legend of Elara Grimshaw, and in that moment, for the first time, a flicker of something beyond mere survival stirred within him. Not love, not freedom, but a strange, unsettling bond, forged in the crucible of the desolated western badlands. The encounter with the rustlers marked a subtle shift in the dynamics between Cal and Elara. The invisible chains were still there, but they felt less restrictive, more like the familiar weight of responsibility. Cal, having faced an external threat alongside her, began to see his forced situation not just as a prison, but as a peculiar, isolated world where he had a defined, albeit involuntary, role. He found himself taking more initiative around the ranch, not just following orders. He suggested improvements to the watering troughs, found better grazing spots for the cattle, and even managed to mend some of the older, oversized tools, adapting them with clever contraptions to suit his own strength. Elara observed his efforts with a quiet approval. Occasionally offering a terse, "Good work, husband," which coming from her was high praise. Cal learned this to interpret her silences, to understand the subtle shifts in her moods. He saw the genuine care she had for her land and her animals, a deep connection to the earth that transcended mere ownership. Her immense solitude was palpable, a vast chasm that even her imposing presence couldn't fill. In reality, she hadn't just wanted a husband for practical reasons. She genuinely wanted companionship on her terms. The no-choice part of his marriage still rankled, but its sting had dulled. He was fed, safe, and had a purpose. He still missed the open road, the anonymity of a drifter, but the stark reality of the outside world, with its unpredictable dangers and empty promises, now seemed less appealing than the strange, secure existence he had found with the giant widow. One morning, months after his capture, Cal found Elara standing by the corral, her head tilted, listening to something only she could hear. He walked up beside her, the familiar sense of being dwarfed no longer quite as unsettling. "What is it?" he asked. "Storm coming," she rumbled, her gaze fixed on the scent, clear horizon. "A big one, days off yet, but it's brewing deep in the mountains." Cal squinted. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue. "Seems clear to me, Elara." She turned her dark eyes on him, a hint of amusement playing on her lips. "You'll learn. This land whispers its secrets if you listen hard enough. We need to reinforce the bond. Bring the herd closer. It'll be a wild one." And so it was. Over the next few days, Cal worked harder than he ever had, preparing for a storm that to his eyes simply wasn't coming. Elara worked alongside him, moving timbers, her strength prodigious, her focus absolute. They spoke little, their movements synchronized, a strange silent partnership forged in anticipation of nature's fury. When the storm finally hit, it was a terrifying spectacle. The wind howled through the canyon like a banshee tearing at the sturdy ranch buildings, rain lashed down in sheets, turning the ground into a churning torrent. Lightning illuminated the night, striking distant peaks with earth-shattering cracks of thunder. Inside the main house, made surprisingly cozy by the roaring fire in the hearth, Cal watched in awe. "You always know, don't you?" he murmured, looking at Elara, whose face was illuminated by the dancing firelight, her eyes reflecting the storm's ferocity. She nodded. "It's my burden, and my gift, this land. It talks to me." She paused, then looked at him, her gaze unusually soft. "You were good, Caleb. You didn't question. You worked." Cal felt a strange warmth spread through him, not from the fire but from her rare compliment. "Had no choice, did I?" he replied, the old phrase taking on a new, almost affectionate irony. Elara actually chuckled, a low, rumbling sound that vibrated through the room. Perhaps not then, But now, husband, you always have a choice. To leave, to stay, to fight, to endure. You chose to endure, and that makes you a stronger man than most. The storm raged through the night, a symphony of chaos outside, a strange peace within. As the first light of dawn broke through the retreating clouds, painting the water-streaked canyon in hues of gold and rose, Cal looked out the window. The ranch ahead, it was battered, but standing, a testament to Elara's foresight and their combined efforts. He turned to Elara, who was already up, preparing a massive breakfast. The morning light caught her, highlighting the lines of strength and solitude on her face. She was still a giant, still imposing, but now, to Cal, she was also Elara, the woman who had claimed him, and in doing so had given him something he hadn't known he was missing, a place. His life was not what he had ever envisioned. It was no longer a free-roaming cowboy, chasing distant horizons. His horizon was now defined by the towering canyon walls of Whisper Creek. His choices, once seemingly limitless, had been narrowed to one single monumental decision made for him. But in the quiet mornings, watching Elara move through her vast kitchen or riding out with her to survey the land, Cal found a strange, unexpected contentment. He might have had no choice in his marriage to the giant widow, Elara Grimshaw, but in the barren, unforgiving heart of the West, he had, against all odds, found a life and a peculiar kind of belonging in her formidable shadow. And as he sat down to breakfast, the steam rising from his plate, he realized that perhaps the greatest freedom wasn't found in the endless empty plains, but in finding a way to live, truly live, within the boundaries of an inescapable fate. He was the giant widow's husband, and for now that was enough.